Oh boy, what a weekend. So the theme behind this past weekend for my girlfriend and I has been going to see two concerts in Southern Ontario. The first of which was Steven Wilson live at the Studio in Hamilton, Ontario. Second of which being Generation Axe in Kitchener, Ontario. Both of these concerts were pretty awesome and slightly disappointing in their own right, and I'm gonna basically just kind of give a really undetailed, unscripted sort of recount of the events of this weekend and those concerts. So my girlfriend and I drove down from Sudbury, which is about 5 hours north of Toronto, on Friday morning, and we eventually made it to Kitchener for around dinner hour. After making ourselves at home at a relative's and getting a good night's sleep, the next day was about our Steven Wilson concert. And that concert took place in Hamilton, which is about another hour's drive away from where we were staying. So the weather was not particularly great. It was very foggy, very misty, raining the whole time. Perfect weather for a Steven Wilson show, if you ask me. When we got to Hamilton and parked at our event, we basically grabbed a coffee at Tim Hortons and waited in line for the show. We weren't waiting in line very long before they actually let us in. We were kind of expecting that the doors would be a little bit later than they were, but they let us in fairly early. Our tickets were also general admission, and we thought it would be standing room only, but it turned out there were some balconies with some seats upstairs that were ripe for the taking. As a result, we got a pretty good view of the stage. We were right next to the PA system, so the speakers were a little on the loud side, but it actually did sound pretty good, considering especially where we were, and, it's Steven Wilson. He kind of makes it a point to make everything sound crystal clear. The performances were great at the Steven Wilson show. I was actually a little surprised at some of the humor elements that Steven incorporates into his show. You think that from songs like The Raven That Refused to Sing or Routine, that he would have a much more dour look on life, but I found that he had some very good humorous banter with the audience, and there was a lot of banter. Not over the top with it, except for maybe his little rant before the song Permeating. But he did do a wonderful job of engaging with the audience, and there was a really good energy at the show. Now, as I mentioned, the musicianship was top-notch at the show. The performances were amazing. During the song Regret Number 9, guitarist Alex Hutchings and keyboardist Adam Holtzman trade solos back and forth, and just the combination of those solos, the chord progression backing them, and the imagery on the screen behind them led to an absolutely spine-tingling event. Wilson and his band also ran through a number of old Porcupine Tree numbers, going as far back as Even Less, which is done just like on the DVD in a sort of a busker version, where he brings out a little Hughes and Kettner amp and plugs it into the PA system and goes, "Hey, check out my little guitar amp." Now, the set list was a little disappointing in that if you own the Home Invasion live DVD, he essentially plays the same show on this tour. Not really too much different, although he did bring in a different Porcupine Tree song at one point, Heart Attack and a Lay-By, which I wasn't actually familiar with the song when he started playing. It took me a moment to kind of clue in this was a different song. And during the encore, he busted out a Prince cover, a cover of Sign of the Times, which was very well done. So even though the set list was a bit of a disappointment, the musicianship, the humorous banter between Steven and his audience, and all that just very much made up for it. I ended up leaving with a couple of t-shirts, Deadwing and Hand Cannot Erase on vinyl, and a really nice hoodie. Sunday was all about Generation Axe. Now, for those who don't know, Generation Axe is sort of a mega tour of 5 different shred guitar players. Steve Vai, Yngwie Malmsteen, Nuno Bettencourt, Zakk Wylde, and Tosin Abasi. And that show took place in Kitchener, the same city that we were staying, so the drive was much shorter, although it was still a little wet and rainy. The venue was much larger. The Steven Wilson show kind of happened in a bit of a smaller club, a little bit more of an intimate sort of setting, whereas this Generation Axe show happened at Centre in the Square, which is a very grand opera hall kind of feel. Very different kind of show. Probably one of the more upscale venues I've ever seen a concert at. Now that show started off with a bit of a sort of an instrumental introduction that features all 5 of the guitar players strutting their stuff, showing off each individual's style, as well as just sort of introducing the audience to the show. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that this was about a 3-hour show and there was no intermission, and yet all 5 of the guitar players shared a backing band, which I thought was kind of cool in a way, because you have this backing band that has to learn 5 completely different styles of music. First up was Tosin Abasi's set. Now, he's the guitar player for the band Animals as Leaders, and anyone who knows that band knows that his music is incredibly complicated. And he did play just a couple of his regular Animals as Leaders numbers, The Woven Web, CAFO, and he brought Nuno Bettencourt out to help him out with physical education. Which Nuno did an admirable job on, although his comment after that about it being the closest thing to a Rush song he'll ever play was, it had me in stitches. Nuno Bettencourt followed Abasi's set, and I'm not really all that familiar with his band Extreme, but I kind of liked what he was doing. It was a little bit more of a funky take on shred, and something that kind of grasped me a little bit more as a guitar player, because I really felt the sort of Eddie Van Halen influence in his playing. And he also had a lot of fun. It was a very fun performance, which, you know, Tosin Abasi is a great guitar player, but he does kind of just stand there and play. Whereas Nuno Bettencourt works the crowd, he works the stage. He's a fantastic singer as well. He was joined by Zakk Wylde for his final song, which was a lengthy blues ballad, whose name and authorship I'm not entirely familiar with. I probably should have checked setlist.fm before I did this video. Then Zakk Wylde's set came on, and I think this was about the first part of the show where my girlfriend and I were kind of checking our watches a little. His choice of songs were all Black Sabbath numbers, and he was doing a great job with the songs themselves. You know, he's a great singer. Anyone who knows his work with Black Label Society or Ozzy Osbourne is quite familiar with his ability to play some really good, crushing, heavy riffs. And his soloing style is something that I'm not mad at. But his solos went on a little bit long. There was a lot of self-indulgence going on. By the same token, he was a very interesting guy to watch, and he did wander into the crowd a few times, and at one point seemingly left the building. Still playing, they set up another antenna for his wireless guitar system, and next thing we know, he's coming up on the balcony with us. He was literally shredding to my face. could literally smell Zakk Wylde. It was entertaining enough, but I did feel like his solos kind of dragged on a little bit. And even though I was really singing along pretty hard with the song War Pigs, I probably could have done without the 20-minute solos. Steve Vai's set came up next, after helping out at the end of Zakk Wylde's set. Just like the last two, he had Nuno Bettencourt come out and help him, and Steve Vai with a cover of Gary Moore's Still Got the Blues. And again, it was a bit of a long, very drawn-out kind of solo, and it wasn't mind-blowing just because it was just so long. But he had Nuno and later on Steve Vai come out and trade solos with him, and that was pretty cool. And then Steve Vai started his set. Now, Steve Vai was the guy I was probably looking forward to the most out of all of these players. I felt like his set seemed a little truncated, and yet lengthened at the same time. He really only played 3 songs in the set. He opened with There's a Fire in the House, which was actually a pretty good rendition. And then he played a song that I think it was Dark Matter from his newest recording, Modern Primitive, where he did some really interesting sort of solo trading with the band. And it was a little lengthy, kind of like Steve Vai's, but at least it was sort of musically entertaining. And then he capped off his set with a blistering performance of For the Love of God. Which I was so entirely stoked to hear live. But at the end, there's a bit of a guitar cadenza sort of thing where it's just Steve, and he dragged that on for a good 6-7 minutes, longer than it probably should have gone on, and I felt like that was a little bit too much of that Zakk Wylde experience again. Now, Steve did not have the next guy come out and help him out with his set, nor did he have Nuno Bettencourt come out and help him out, but he just kind of transitioned straight on to Yngwie Malmsteen. There's a lot to unpack about the Yngwie Malmsteen set. That was probably one of the most offensive concert sets I've ever seen. And I don't mean offensive like politically incorrect or offensive to my social sensibilities. I mean musically offensive. Now, I'm already kind of a bit biased against Yngwie Malmsteen because I kind of perceive a lot of his guitar playing as being very one-sided. He kind of has one thing he does really well, but he absolutely went over the top in displaying it. There was hardly a semblance of a melody during his set. It was mostly just as much over-the-top harmonic minor wank that he could pull out of his Strat. Probably the biggest show of musical egotism I've ever seen. He did play a couple of his classic numbers, including Far Beyond the Sun, and he eventually had Steve Vai come out and help him out with the song Black Star, but just the sheer amount of guitar wankage on display during his set. I mean, I can tolerate that kind of thing from the other guitar players, even Zakk Wylde's solos. I mean, he did something entertaining with them. He walked out into the crowd. He was flailing wildly the whole time, but he was at least engaging the audience. He was being cool. Yngwie Malmsteen was just kind of shredding for the sake of shredding. At some points, it was literally just his guitar playing. The band just walked away. He did have a moment where there were some melodies creeping in with just him on guitar and some orchestral music on backing track, but overall, his set just went on about half an hour longer than it should have. There were no songs. It was really just him up there playing as many notes as he could in 40 minutes. And then at the end of his set, it started to turn into not just musical wankage, but just guitar abuse. kicking his guitar around, smashing it against his floor wedge monitors. I mean, these are all things that are like great shows of showmanship when you've earned it. But Yngwie just irritated me. It was probably the worst musical experience I've ever had at a concert was watching Yngwie's set. Now luckily they brought it back together when all 5 of them got back out on stage and did their sort of big encore, all 5 of us working together to make a cool musical whole section. And they did 3 songs, one of which was a little bit impromptu, and all 3 of them covers. They did Edgar Winter's Frankenstein, which is sort of a staple of the Generation X set, and they did a pretty good job of that, where 4 of them, Yngwie Malmsteen was not involved in that one, were trading solos back and forth, and I thought that was pretty cool. Then Yngwie returned for a instrumental performance of Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, in which all of the vocal parts done by Freddie Mercury were replaced with the 5 guitar players harmonizing together. And unlike a lot of the other cover songs in the set, this one was actually very faithful to the original. They didn't extend it with a 20-minute solo or anything. They just harmonized beautifully, did probably what I would consider to be one of the most interesting but wonderful tributes to Freddie Mercury I can think of. Pretty fitting, given the fact that Bohemian Rhapsody is one of the biggest movies in the box office right now. And finally, they closed their set with a Deep Purple cover. Just like Frankenstein, they used this as sort of an opportunity to show all 5 of them, this time Yngwie joining them, kind of doing their own thing. And whereas the solo section in Frankenstein kind of gave them a track to each do their own thing over, Byrne kind of let them do more their own thing. Each of the solo sections was sort of geared to each guitar player. Zakk Wylde got a cool riff, Nuno got something funky, Steve Vai got his cosmic chord progression, the band did something a little more power metal for Yngwie, and Tosin basically got the bass solo section, except doing his thumping technique on an 8-string guitar. Which I thought was really funny because even though it's clearly just showmanship, you have Nuno, Steve, and Zakk all kind of crouching up on Tosin like, what are you doing? How dare you come up with a technique that we have to steal? So I thought that was pretty fun. So thankfully the whole Generation X band kind of brought everything back together at the end after a couple of sets that kind of left me a little wanting. And the first couple sets were really great, so I guess it's kind of like the Star Trek V of concerts. As for merch, well, I ended up picking up this shirt, this vinyl, and a copy of Tosin Abasi's Thump instructional DVD. Because I'm never gonna learn how to thump. I mean, look at these thumbs. So anyway, that was the concerts, and the drive back home, well, it's been snowing and slush. Wasn't a very fun drive, but what are you gonna do? It's Canada in the start of winter. This is the best you can do. Another highlight from the trip was going to a little restaurant in Kitchener, Ontario called Kinkaku Izakaya. It's a sushi, Japanese cuisine place on King Street. Absolutely the greatest beef teriyaki you'll ever eat. It's so amazing. It just comes out sizzling on a cast iron piece of metal. It's so delicious, you'll love it. Anyway, thank you for watching, and hopefully I get to see a couple really good shows next year as well.